Our next speaker is Russell Glasser. He is the host of the Atheist Experience podcast and a member of the atheist community of Austin. Once again, you can direct your questions to @SojoCalCon on Twitter. And Russell, you can take it away.
Well, hi everyone. I'm Russell Glasser. I'm a software engineer in Austin, Texas, and I also host a public access TV show called The Atheist Experience, as well as another podcast called The Nonprofits. The Atheist Experience won the Austin Chronicles Award for Best Public Access TV Show for 3 years in a row. And it was at that point that I think in reaction to that, they just stopped having a category for Best Public Access TV Show. So we haven't won any more since then, but you can catch us on Ustream, and now you can also see reruns on the American Atheist Roku channel regularly. So when people ask what the mission is of the Atheist Experience, I usually say that the most important aspect is outreach to other people who are already atheists. And that's because people who say they don't believe in God make up less than 5% of the United States, compared to about 85% who do identify as Christians of one type or another. I don't know just how different things are in Calgary, but that's a difficult situation for people to be in, especially because some Christians are openly hostile to atheists, and they accuse us of wanting to destroy morality or ruin faith for everybody. Often, young adults will realize that they no longer believe in God, and they will call us because they're afraid to tell their parents for fear that they're going to be kicked out of their houses or maybe cut off from their education. So my personal experience, I grew up in a lot of different places, but for me, one of the most memorable parts of my childhood was being an atheist in kindergarten in Auburn, Alabama. Now, for people who don't know U.S. geography all that well, Alabama is just about the deepest part of the Deep South that you can get into, the real Bible Belt part of the country that you're always hearing about. And I quickly discovered that the other kids found me a little bit of an oddity. In fact, I remember a period of a few weeks when this little gang of kids would come up to me every day, and then one of them would say to me, "Do you believe in God?" And then I would say, "No." And then he would turn to the rest of the kids and say, "See? Isn't that weird?" And then they just walk away and probably come back the next day with a different group of kids. That was one of the first times in my life that I encountered what I later came to recognize as Christian privilege. Now, contrary to what you might have expected, the other kids didn't beat me up at the end of the story. They didn't try to change my mind. They just didn't know what to make of me. In their world, Christianity had always been the default position. Most kids in Auburn grow up in religious households and go to church all their lives and surround themselves with other people who assume that there has to be an all-powerful creator of the universe. So meeting somebody who doesn't believe in God is like meeting somebody who says, "Well, I don't believe your grandma is real." It's unlikely to shake up their worldview because their religious beliefs get so much positive reinforcement and support every day of their lives that the alternative just makes no sense. Now, when I say this was an example of Christian privilege, what I mean by privilege is that you have some quality in your background, upbringing, or genetics that gives you a social advantage over people who don't have it. A lot of people can only recognize prejudice when it takes the form of direct aggression, like an assault or a lynching, something like that. But in reality, a lot of discrimination that happens against groups of people takes place through small ways in which one group is pulled up and another is pushed down. I got off pretty easy in kindergarten. The other kids in my school were just confused. But I've heard enough from other atheists to know that I could have run into far worse kinds of bullying. Atheists at least here in the United States, are often treated as second-class citizens. According to law professor Eugene Volokh, a lot of parents have had their visitation and custody rights with their children limited or denied after a divorce, partly because of their advocacy of atheism. Texas law, my home state, allows juries to decide custody cases based partly on a parent's religious beliefs, teachings, or practices, allowing them to deny custody if they believe that the parent's beliefs are immoral or harmful to the child, which sounds good in theory, but then you combine it with like a 2004 Gallup survey, which says that 51% of Americans agree that the statement, "It is necessary to believe in God in order to be moral and have good values," is true. A lot of judges similarly think that they are allowed to sentence people to go to church. Like in 2012, an Oklahoma judge gave a drunk driving teen a decade-long probation on the condition that he meet several conditions that included attending church regularly. Of course, a lot of people would probably rather sit in church than go to jail, but this kind of ruling inherently slants the legal system against non-believers. Despite the United States Constitution explicitly prohibiting a religious test for office, 6 state constitutions still say something similar to the Texas version. And I'm quoting here, "Nor shall anyone be excluded from holding office on account of his religious sentiments, provided he acknowledge the existence of a supreme being." You might think that that would never stand up in court, and it usually doesn't, but in 2009, just 6 years ago, Cecil Bothwell won an election for an Asheville, North Carolina city council seat and was then challenged by his opponent as violating the state constitution's rule against denying Almighty God. Even when these cases don't hold legal weight, they can still be used as a stalling tactic to try and prevent candidates from finishing their applications in time and shutting them out of elections that way. Now, those are just a few ways in which atheists are faced with the bad end of religious privilege. And it does sometimes take the form of overt discriminations, but other times we just run into pervasive harmful attitudes from theists. Like, for instance, I was once hosting the Atheist Experience with my friend Jeff D, and it's a call-in show, so a woman called in, and the first thing she wanted to know was why we worshiped Satan. We tried to explain to her that we don't believe in Satan, but she insisted over and over again that this was what she heard about atheists in church, and then she called on Christians to boycott the restaurant where we always announce that we're going to eat after the show. Dinesh D'Souza is the author of several books with titles like What's So Great About Christianity and Life After Death. He used to be the president of King's College in New York for 2 years. And Dinesh D'Souza, in What's So Great About Christianity, wrote, "Atheism is motivated not by reason, but by a cowardly moral escapism. Atheists don't find God invisible so much as objectionable. They aren't adjusting their desires to the truth, but rather the truth to fit their desires. This is the perennial appeal of atheism. It gets rid of the stern fellow with the long beard and liberates us for the pleasures of sin and depravity. The atheist seeks to get rid of moral judgment by getting rid of the judge." So Dinesh D'Souza here is expressing another pretty common view about atheists. He thinks we really do secretly believe in God, but we just hate being told that we can't go off and do all the terrible, selfish, hedonistic things that we want to. Now, maybe it's a little bit unkind to bring this up, but in 2012, Dinesh resigned from King's College after he was caught in a sex scandal. He and the woman involved were both married to other people at the time, and then in May, as if that wasn't bad enough, he pleaded guilty to illegal political donations, and now he's going to serve a year in prison. Schadenfreude aside, lots of Christians agree with Dinesh that believing in God gives you an extra level of virtue and moral authority, which it obviously does not. But this attitude is pervasive through our political system. In 2007, the Secular Coalition for America ran a survey to find out if there were any openly atheist members of Congress. They found one. Representative Pete Stark answered their survey and was declared as the first known atheist congressman. But that's not very impressive when you consider that we've been running this country for 200 years, well over 200 years, excuse me, with 100 senators and 435 representatives, give or take, at different times. And the representatives are re-elected every 2 years. So that is a lot of public representatives and not a single atheist identified up until Pete Stark. And even then, they had to hunt him down because it goes without saying that Pete didn't exactly brag about being an atheist while he was campaigning. That might have something to do with the fact that a 2012 Gallup poll showed that most people would be less likely to vote for an atheist than a gay person, a Mormon, or a Muslim. I mean, even the Republican Party ran a Mormon in 2012, but I am pretty sure it's still going to be a number of years before the Democratic Party would dare to put an atheist on the presidential ticket. And a study conducted by the University of British Columbia in 2011 actually indicated that people find atheists to be, on the whole, less trustworthy than rapists. Now, obviously, that's an unfair perception. Atheists as a group are generally no more likely to commit crimes than any other group. Religious people say that they get their sense of right and wrong from God, but in reality, they get their moral understanding from the same place as anybody else does. It is a combination of empathy, upbringing, and social pressures. But it might be easy for atheists to get in the habit of feeling like the victims of privilege, and on some level, they certainly are. But in my experience, atheists can sometimes fall into a different sort of moral superiority. I always hear words like logic, reason, and rationality getting thrown around in atheist circles, and I think it's a way of justifying the very real sacrifices that people make for openly denouncing religion. Whatever the other faults may be of religious institutions, what they do provide is social support through churches and easily identifiable friendships. Granted,
Okay, you're freezing.
believes, and they tend to offer
Is he gone?
with a group easier for you, and that's Christian privilege in action.
Oh,
So,
sorry, you're
yes.
just freezing on us. We've missed the last little bit of what you said.
Okay, where was I?
Last minute or two.
Should I go back to, let's see, okay, so it might be easy for atheists to get in the habit of feeling like the victims of privilege, and on one level they certainly are. Is this okay?
Yeah.
Okay. But in my experience, moral superiority, logic, reason, and rationality getting thrown around a lot in atheist circles. And I think that is a way of justifying the very real sacrifices that people do make for openly denouncing a religion. Because whatever the other faults may be of religious institutions, one thing they do provide is social support through churches and through easily identifiable friendships. So granted, that support does come at a cost of believing what everybody else believes, and they tend to ostracize anyone who's not in the in-group. But still, if you are identifying with the group that's primarily in power and accounts for 85% of your neighbors, that makes life easier for you, and that's Christian privilege in action. So why would a person leave the church and give all that up? The only good reason is that they're firmly convinced that the religious position doesn't make any sense, obviously. they're staking out a position that the majority opinion is wrong and isn't supported by evidence. And they would say that even Pascal's wager isn't good enough to make you blindly roll the dice on that position. And going against the grain like that can be a little scary, and because people want to push down that self-doubt a little bit, there is something I have noticed where atheists seem to think that they're more rational than anyone else in the world. I think that nobody personified this better than Ayn Rand, who invented her own philosophy called objectivism. She believed that she could objectively identify correct moral behaviors, and her values were not influenced by interaction and consensus with other people, but they were just true. In 1968, Ayn Rand wrote an essay saying, "I do not think that a rational woman can want to be president. Observe that I did not say she would be unable to do the job. I said that she could not want it. It is not a matter of her ability, but of her values. For a woman qua woman, the essence of femininity is hero worship, the desire to look up to a man." Now, Ayn Rand's personal taste, of course, ran towards dominant men that she could look up to, and that's a theme that comes up over and over again in her novels. And so she deemed that to be an objective virtue. In Atlas Shrugged, we get another taste of this when one of the minor characters explains to Dagny, the heroine, "I like cigarettes, Miss Taggart. I like to think of fire held in a man's hand. Fire, a dangerous force tamed at his fingertips. When a man thinks, there's a spot of fire alive in his mind, and it's proper that he should have the burning point of a cigarette as his one expression." Ayn Rand also seemed to think that smoking is an objective moral virtue because she had the personal preference of being a heavy smoker herself. And so she promoted the value of smoking as marking a more trustworthy person, and a lot of her closest associates imitated her by following suit. Of course, Rand grew up in a time before the link between cigarettes and cancer was firmly established, but even though this connection was discovered in her lifetime, she remained a smoker until she was diagnosed with lung cancer later in life, eventually requiring surgery at the age of 69. Now, I'm bringing all this up not to single out Ayn Rand, but to highlight the perils of overcommitting to your own prejudices. I hear a lot of atheists stating that because they're reasonable and rational people, anyone else who disagrees with them is automatically unreasonable and irrational. Well, as my friend Matt Dillahunty likes to say, just because you've come up with the right answer to the easiest question in the world doesn't make you a genius. Atheists are just as prone to bad judgment as everyone else. Even great scientists are often known to get bogged down in the certainty of their own brilliance and fall for terrible ideas, like Isaac Newton, who pioneered modern physics and invented calculus, and then he spent the last part of his life obsessed with biblical chronology and alchemy. Linus Pauling was the only person to ever win 2 unshared Nobel Prizes, and he followed that up by promoting a whole bunch of really weird medical pseudoscience about vitamin C. Being smart and educated is no defense against having false beliefs, and neither is atheism. In fact, science is essentially based on the idea that no one person is correct all the time. Everybody experiences confirmation bias, and so it's important not to feel too smug or self-satisfied about the positions that you hold. The moment you start believing you're infallible, that's when you make a mistake. Science is the effort to correct our faulty assumptions and come to a greater understanding about what's really true about the world. And that's why I advocate that people try to take a scientific approach to questions that arise in their own experience. So when you hear a new claim for the first time,
You're freezing again.
you ask is, how do I believe? You go out of your way to find opposing viewpoints.
Sorry, you're freezing again. Can you go back another minute or two?
Okay. I don't know whose end that's on, but
Yeah, no idea here either. You just finished talking about it was when you were talking about atheists perceiving themselves as more rational, it cut out there.
Okay. I got through the whole Ayn Rand bit, right? Hello? Can you hear me?
I did, yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
Um, so my friend Matt Dillahunty likes to say that just because you've come up with the right answer to the easiest question in the world doesn't make you a genius. Um, Lots of very smart people get bogged down in the certainty of their own brilliance, and then they fall for very bad ideas, like Isaac Newton, who pioneered modern physics and invented calculus, and then spent the last part of his life obsessed with alchemy and biblical chronology. Linus Pauling was the only person to ever win 2 unshared Nobel Prizes, and he followed that up by promoting a whole bunch of really weird medical pseudoscience about vitamin C. So being smart and educated is no defense against having false beliefs, and neither is atheism. And science would advocate that you recognize that no one person is correct. All of your own ideas because it's appealing and it makes sense to the beliefs you already hold. So you should go out of your way to find people from different backgrounds from your own and listen to arguments that you haven't really heard or understood before. But some atheists have got a real problem with being effectively self-critical. Nothing disappoints me more than hearing a prominent atheist like, let's take an example, Sam Harris, who had an interview recently where he was asked why most atheists are male. And he said, well, people just don't like to have their ideas criticized. There's something about that critical posture that is to some degree intrinsically male and more attractive to guys than to women. Atheism doesn't have this nurturing, coherence-building, extra estrogen vibe that you would want by default if you wanted to attract as many women as men. That's really frustrating to me because I've seen a lot of intelligent and enthusiastic women dismissed using flimsy justifications just like that one. Sometimes an entrenched majority might think they're being skeptical when they're really just dismissing or shouting down valid points from other people's backgrounds. And when new members run into this, often they'll conclude that their input just isn't welcome and they'll go be involved in some other group instead. And so sometime later, the remaining members can look around and say, hey, we're still mostly a community of middle-class white males. Wonder why that is. I guess that just proves that women and minorities aren't as good at logic as we are. Is everybody still... I'm not freezing again, am I?
Nope, you're good.
Okay. Just thought I'd check. Atheism is kind of geeky, and I'm into a lot of other geeky things. I am a software engineer after all, and that's another area of interest that has been pretty dominated by white males for most of my life. I'm a pretty big gamer. In fact, you may have been there when HJ tried to set up a test hangout for me before this started, and I was busy in the middle of a Heroes of the Storm match. Sorry about that. But when I have a hobby that gives me pleasure and satisfaction, I like to share it with a lot of other people. My little sister grew up playing Super Mario with me. My wife can kick my ass in first-person shooters, and she won first and second place in the annual interactive fiction authoring competition for the last 2 years. And so the more gender balanced my hobbies have become, the happier I've been because a wider audience means a broader selection of games that appeal to more people. And over the course of my lifetime, there have been a lot of commendable efforts to make games more accessible to men and women, but a lot of men don't seem to like that. And in the last few years, I've seen a lot of blatant hostility pushing against that trend. Like last October, feminist game commentator Anita Sarkeesian, who has just been named as Harvard Humanist of the Year, by the way, was scheduled to speak at Utah State University when administrators of the school received a threatening email warning that a shooting massacre would be carried out at the event. The email said, "This will be the deadliest school shooting in a..."
You froze again.
Hiss to stop it. in reality was the 1989 in a mass shooting in Montreal before taking his own life. Um, there's also been a lot of news in the last year about a game designer named Zoe Quinn who was accused by her ex-boyfriend of trading sex for bad reviews and then got slammed with thousands of hate mails originating from an online group called 4chan. They called her father at home to let him know that she was a slut, and they targeted her friends, and at one point she actually had to leave her home and call the police for fear of her safety. It doesn't matter what you think of her games or opinions at that point, violent threats are never okay. Public defenders of this phenomenon, which they've called Gamergate, like Christina Hoff Sommers, claim that this is a backlash against what they consider a war against boys. They characterize women as invading a traditionally mostly male space and say they should just accept sexism in games because it's not their territory. Well, I'm a man. I like video games. I like women. I would like the two to be introduced to each other as much as possible. In a kind of a similar way, atheist activism has previously been kind of slanted towards men, and for a couple of decades I've often heard my fellow atheists speculate about why more women aren't active in the movement. But then when women do speak out about their personal experiences, suddenly we don't want to hear them, and they're getting snide comments about their appearance instead of discussion of their input. And my concern about sexism isn't just what people say to women, it's also the knee-jerk tendency to justify that behavior. Oh, women are getting harassed in games? Well, that's just video game culture. You should learn to suck it up and deal with it. What, there aren't very many women speaking at atheist conventions? Well, that must be because women don't understand the nuances of our subject. Or maybe some men at conferences don't understand boundaries and ask for dates in inappropriate settings. Well, don't hate on socially awkward men. They can't help themselves. But the effect of these kinds of dismissive remarks is that if it's plain ignorance, then we could deal with it and educate people about it. But it's the rush to justify this behavior that winds up being a bigger problem than the behavior itself, because it gives the message that we aren't interested in solutions. Now, despite all that, I love what the worldwide atheist community has been doing in the last few years. There are more and more loose groups that are cooperating with each other to create a larger social network of friendly atheists. And that kind of social activity just doesn't happen on its own. For years I was hearing people saying that it was impossible to keep an atheist group together because it was like herding cats. Now, I think we moved forward in that regard, and thanks you guys for helping out by hosting this online conference, but we still have a long way to go. I moderate a few online activities myself. The Atheist Experience TV show airs live on a website called Ustream, and all Ustream shows have a live chat attached to the page, so we have kind of an official show chat. And for a long time, we used to ignore this chat completely, and we started getting more and more email over time complaining about it because people said they couldn't stand to join the chat. It was full of sexually explicit conversations and bigotry and personal insults. And at first, we used to dismiss these emails, saying we weren't responsible for what other people write in a free speech zone. Am I still coming through okay?
Yeah, you're good.
Good. But eventually we realized that our name and our reputation was on this chat, and it was driving people away from the show and leaving them with a bad feeling about the community that we were trying to foster. So we wrote up a lot of rules, a lot of them very subjective, but we enforced them consistently, and we kicked people out of the chat on a regular basis after a brief warning. And you know what? That worked. It took a few months for the toxic atmosphere to improve, and we got a lot of email about how we were violating the freedom of people in the chat room, and we still kick out a few people each week, but on the whole, the regular participants are much better behaved than they used to be, and they have civil and productive conversations. This reminds me a lot of the rise and fall of a website called Chat Roulette. That site was originally envisioned as a randomized video chat. You would hit a button and get automatically matched with somebody else online, and then you have a conversation with them. But apparently, about 1 in 8 times you would find yourself having a conversation with somebody's penis. Because while most people are well behaved online, a small number of people really wanted to let their exhibitionist flag fly, and without any kind of constraints on the rules, there was no reason not to. So chat roulette wound up with this terrible reputation and became a huge joke. And of course, it only got worse because it attracted more and more people who heard that they could use this platform to shock people for fun, and that drove away the kinds of customers that wanted to have interesting conversations with strangers, which was the original intent of the site. And it became such a well-known problem that lots of major news programs and The Daily Show did segments on what a bad site chat roulette was. Ironically, in spite of the fact that chat roulette was apparently going for as much freedom as possible, what they experienced was a critical failure of the free market, because you can either let the exhibitionists run wild and have their freedom, or you can have a site that's usable by, let's say, younger people and mature, non-crotch obsessed adults, but you can't have both. And which is a bigger customer base? And the atheist movement needs to confront the same questions. Because a lot of times over the last few years, various organizations have introduced codes of conduct and anti-harassment rules. And even though these initiatives have mostly been well received, they've also gotten a lot of pushback. People say that these kinds of rules stifle freedom, and people won't have as much fun at the events. But if there's one thing I've learned about fostering a welcoming social community, it's that you can't have it both ways either. People have their natural prejudices, and that's okay. We're not thought police. But you should recognize that that's an issue. Being neutral about behavior is not actually neutral. It's favorable to the entrenched majority. If members of a mostly white male community only talk to each other, then they'll just reinforce their prejudices and drive away the women and ethnic minorities who might have other experiences to bring to the table. And fighting against...
You've frozen once again.
...not acceptable, and some behaviors should be discouraged. Some of the... Yes?
You're freezing.
Oh, no.
You got to the point where you're talking about chasing away women and visible minorities.
Oh, okay. That was only like a few seconds.
Yeah, it wasn't that long ago.
Okay. So fighting against this dynamic means you recognize privilege and you call it out when you see it, and you let your fellow members know that some behaviors are not acceptable and should be discouraged. Some of the same atheists who might dismiss this as politically correct would have no problem recognizing the Christian privilege that I was talking about at the beginning. And we argue passionately against policies that support the religious status quo. So we should expect no less from within our own groups. And that's it.
Thank you. So there is a list of questions here for you.
Okay.
The first one, what was it like being raised secular in the Bible Belt?
Well, like I said at the beginning, I did...
Oh, yeah. You've frozen again.
I just had this... There were some cases where the parents would find out that I was an atheist, but actually I had some friction with my best friend after I left Alabama and moved to Santa Fe at the age of 10, and his family was Catholic, and for a while they wouldn't let him play with me at all. But you know, for the most part, kids are still learning their identity at that young age, and a lot of backup for my opinion. I wound up going to my dad, who was an atheist physicist, to find out more information about atheism and then explain it to other kids. And I think I was pretty lucky to be able to go to a pretty liberal high school and college, so I didn't really have that many problems.
Okay. What did you have a coming out experience, or what was that like?
No, I mean, I know most atheists wind up, start out being Christians of one flavor or another and then have to come out to their friends and families. But for me, both my parents were secular Jews, and even though I had a bar mitzvah, at first it never occurred to me that being an atheist was something that I was supposed to keep secret. And it may have made a lot of people uncomfortable that I wasn't aware of, but I have always been pretty outspoken as an atheist, even from kindergarten.
Why do you think it's important for podcasts like the Atheist Experience to exist? Hello?
Towards on the atheist. One of them is that, as I said, we are doing outreach. We are sitting there and we're talking about atheism, and most of the time we're being pretty nice about it, and we put a positive face on the community, and we get all kinds of emails that say things like, "Oh wow, I never realized that other people thought like me." It's a lot like what Zinnia Jones was saying in the talk before me, where she said a lot of people didn't know that there was a word for what they for how they identified as a transgender person. And similarly, a lot of young atheists have no idea that atheism is actually a philosophical position. But also, we think that the arguments for Christianity are bad. And for religion in general. And we think that confronting them directly in kind of an open and, like I said, mostly friendly.
Frozen once again. You've frozen. Hello?
I think I may have frozen up again for a minute.
Yes.
Okay.
You just finished talking about Zinnia Jones, comparing coming out.
Yeah, so we get a lot of emails from people saying I never knew that there was a word for this, and they didn't know that it was a valid philosophical.
You froze again.
And
Okay.
we think that it's productive to confront the bad apologetics arguments that you hear all the time, and take some of the wind out of them. And it's fun.
How would you challenge the belief that atheists can't be moral?
There are a lot of different ways that I've addressed this question. One of them was something that Plato brought up in one of the Socratic dialogues a long time ago, which is known now as the Euthyphro dilemma, where somebody asserted that he was doing a good thing that.
You froze again.
And our story said, "Well, tell me more about this. Do the gods want what is good because they know it's good, or is it good because the gods want it?" And both answers lead to kind of a trap, because if the Christian God, for instance, already knows that some things just are good or bad, then he's actually kind of a middleman. He's not doing anything useful in defining morality. He's just passing along the information to us. But if whatever God wants is automatically good, that's another problem, because that makes morality kind of subject to his arbitrary whims, where Actually, I really meant murdering and stealing is perfect. It's A-okay, and that's the best thing for everybody. Um, and that doesn't seem to be really what we want either, because we recognize that there are practical values and not just arbitrary religious values to having rules against killing and stealing.
You've frozen again.
Most of the Bible or the Quran or what have you, that really don't sound that good for us, and they learn to kind of rationalize those things away, like stoning rebellious teenagers to death of what the Bible says. I guess I've rambled enough about that topic.
What are your feelings about the accusation that you're a social justice warrior?
Um, that's an accusation? No, seriously, I know that that's used as an insult. But I think that social justice basically means uh, being passionately in favor of a better life for all kinds of groups of people. And I think that people who object to that and use it as a pejorative um, have a kind of narrow view that that they may be uncomfortable being criticized about things which others might take as being racist or sexist or otherwise discriminating against a particular group. And I think that they should be uncomfortable about that.
How should we deal with the perception that atheists are more rational than everybody else?
Well, I'm personally biased. I think that a person who has who looks at religious claims with clear eyes will more often than not come to the conclusion that they aren't well justified. And so I do think to a certain extent that atheism is correct and a smart thing to believe in. Um, but I have a lot of friends who are religious and who are smarter than a lot of atheist people I know. uh, and I would never say that a religious person is an idiot for being religious. And I certainly have gotten enough email from atheists to make me think that there are a lot of atheists out there that I wouldn't like to hang out with very much. Uh, that might be a little bit snobby of me, but um, when people ask me to recommend good books for a new atheist, I generally recommend books that are about reason and critical thinking and not specifically about atheism. I like people to read science books because I want people to live up to this idea that atheists are supposed to be rational, and I don't want them to just coast on the idea that, well, I stopped believing in God, so now I'm smarter than all you dumbasses.
How should we deal with the problem of sexism within the atheist community?
Um, I think I have made it a personal policy that, well, first of all, I'm kind of new to the atheist speaking circuit. I've done the TV show for like
You've frozen again.
started trying to get in on and online talks like this, and I have quickly made it a policy that whenever anybody invites me to something, I immediately say like, I'd like to do this, and have you also considered here's my list of great women speakers and people of color and transgender people, and I keep this list around because I would like conventions to move towards welcoming more people of varied backgrounds. The
You've frozen again.
we let's see. Um, we are interested in appealing to a broader to a broader group of people, and I think that when you have more diverse representation, you also welcome in a more diverse audience automatically, and also I think that being vigilant against sexism and racism and making that sort of socially unacceptable is a good step.
Okay. What do you think the atheists can do to challenge negative perceptions held about us?
Um, I would say that people should be that people who are comfortable with being out, and I would never say that anybody has still that negative. Hang on. Okay, just waiting for the video to catch up with me. I would never say that anybody has to be out as an atheist because there is still that negative social stigma where you could risk losing your job or getting longer jail sentences or losing custody. Is comfortable with the idea. Because people are comfortable with atheism. Uh, the more people who are comfortable with openly stating their atheism, the more people will see that atheists are just folks.
Okay,
And I suppose you should also familiarize yourself with dispassionate arguments that are just good responses to belief in God.
the next one's a bit of an amusing one.
Okay.
How do you not have a permanent dent in your head from all the head desking on the atheist experience?
Um, like I said, it is more fun than you would think. And even though things get kind of repetitive, I come at it from kind of a gamer's perspective, where it's not necessarily a bad thing to practice the same kind of thing over and over again because that's how you improve. And so whenever I'm coming up against some guy who is throwing version 11 billion of Pascal's wager at me and saying, why are you an atheist? Don't you know you're going to hell? I take some pleasure in kind of honing the response and recognizing what variation of Christian apologetics they're throwing at me and having an answer ready before they're done talking. And just having sort of a toolkit that is developed over time through practice, where this is the best answer to Pascal's wager. This is the best answer to the first cause argument. This is what you say in response to people saying that atheists have no morals. And just having that basket of talking points ready to go is kind of interesting and fun. And if a call winds up not being fun, I always have the hang up button.
So, last question. You mentioned reading science. Do you have any opinion about including philosophy and formal logic along with reading science education books?
Oh, sure. And when I say reading science, I first and foremost mean reading about the philosophy of science, because science is full of a lot of math, and a lot of people find that hard. I like math, but most people can get the hang of the concept behind the scientific method, and I think that reading philosophy is good for the soul, so to speak. I think that when I've been at some depressing times of my life, it's done me a lot of good to read things like Bertrand Russell's The Conquest of Happiness, or other books that tell you not just how to recognize truth, but how to get the most out of life. So yeah, philosophy is great. And I have no patience for people who say that philosophy is just a bunch of guys bullshitting about things they made up off the top of their head.
Okay, thank you, Russell. That is the end of it, so I guess we'll let you say goodbye and move on. Thank
Okay.
you.
Thank you very much for having me. Bye.
You didn't do the write-up for